The wagon gate slammed shut before Owen Barrett could pull his supply cart through the mining camp entrance. A guard's hand grabbed the reins. Another man reached for the canvas cover. And beneath those rough boards, a thin schoolteacher named Grace Holloway held her breath with a stack of stolen contracts pressed against her chest. She had been dismissed from the camp school that morning, not because she failed her students, not because she broke any rule. She was thrown out because she taught miners how to read the papers they were forced to sign. Now she was hiding among Owen's flour sacks and iron tools while company guards searched every wagon leaving and entering the camp. Her hands trembled, but not from the cold. Grace knew what those papers meant. Men had worked months underground and received almost nothing because the company had written false debts beside their names. A miner could earn wages all week and still owe the company by Saturday night. The numbers were designed to look official, and most workers could not read enough to challenge them. The guard lifted the canvas flap. Owen moved before he could think. "She's with me," he said. The guard looked over his shoulder. "Who?" Owen stared at the wagon, then at the men watching him. "My wife." The word hung there longer than either of them expected. Inside the wagon, Grace looked up. Owen Barrett had never been a man who lied easily. Everyone in town knew that. He repaired broken tools, rebuilt wagon wheels, and spoke only when he had something worth saying. But now he had just tied his name to a woman the company wanted removed. The guard narrowed his eyes. "Didn't know you were married. Didn't ask the whole county for permission," Owen answered. The guard stepped closer. "Company rules say only workers and their dependents enter through this gate." Owen placed one hand on the wagon rail. "Then she's my dependent." The guard studied him, searching for weakness. Behind Owen, the mining camp stretched across the valley. Smoke rose from the processing buildings. Men walked back from the shafts with tired faces and empty pockets. Every person there knew the company controlled the gates, the stores, and the wages. And every person there knew what happened to those who challenged it. The guard finally stepped away, but not before warning him. "Your wife causes trouble, Barrett, and trouble follows you out." Owen drove forward. Only after the wagon passed through the gate did he speak again. "You have about 5 seconds to explain why I just risked my entire life." Grace slowly pushed the canvas aside. "I didn't ask you to risk your life." "No," Owen said. "You hid in my wagon." She climbed down carefully, still holding the contracts. "I needed someone who could get past that gate. And you decided my name was convenient." Her eyes met his. "No, I decided your name was honest." That answer bothered Owen more than anger would have. Because deep down he knew exactly why. He had seen those miners come into his blacksmith shop with broken tools and unpaid bills. He had watched men sign papers they could not understand. He had wondered why nobody fought back. But wondering was safer than standing up. Grace looked toward the company buildings. "They don't want these papers seen." "What are they?" "The reason half this camp will never leave." Owen took the contracts from her hand. The pages looked ordinary. That was the frightening part. No blood. No threats. No obvious crime. Just numbers written neatly by men who knew nobody would question them. And somewhere inside that pile of paper was the truth that had forced Grace into his wagon. If this story reminds you that one person choosing to stand beside someone else can change everything, stay with this journey. Because the most dangerous thing inside that mining camp was not the machinery underground. It was the truth waiting to be read. Owen folded the papers and looked toward the company office at the top of the hill. Then he heard a hammer strike from the guard tower. Someone had noticed Grace was missing, and they were already coming for the woman he had just called his wife. Owen Barrett did not bring Grace Holloway into his home because he trusted her. He brought her there because leaving her alone inside the mining camp would have been the same as handing her over. His blacksmith shop sat near the edge of the company grounds, far enough from the main offices that the supervisors rarely bothered with it, but close enough that every worker in the camp knew where to find him when a pickaxe broke or a wagon wheel cracked. It was not much of a hiding place, but it was the only place he had. Grace stepped inside the small room behind the forge and looked around. There was an iron stove, a narrow cot, a wooden table covered with tools. A shelf holding old account books Owen used to track orders. No decoration. No comfort. Just a place built by a man who believed anything worth keeping should be repaired instead of replaced. "You can stay until dark," Owen said. Grace looked at him. "Until dark? Then we'll figure out what happens next." She glanced toward the door. "They will search." "I know." "They will question you." "I know." "They may take your shop." Owen placed the contracts on the table. "That part one don't know." Grace studied him. Most men she had met in the camp reacted to trouble by looking for someone stronger to hide behind. Owen reacted by checking what needed fixing. It was a strange kind of courage, and it made her nervous, because courage like that often came with a price. "You should have left me outside the gate," she said. Owen looked at the papers. "Maybe." "Then why didn't you?" He did not answer immediately. The truth was not simple. He had spent years telling himself that survival meant keeping his head down. His father had taught him that. His brother Thomas had repeated it often. Work hard. Keep quiet. Don't fight men who own the land beneath your boots. But when he saw Grace hiding beneath that canvas, shaking and exhausted, he remembered something he had forgotten. There were some things a person could not watch happen and still call himself decent. "You were scared," he finally said. Grace looked away. "I was angry." Both can be true. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Owen noticed something. The schoolteacher who had been brave enough to steal contracts from a mining company was carefully breaking a piece of bread into tiny portions. Not eating. Saving. "You're hungry," he said. "I'm fine." "You haven't eaten." "I said I'm fine." Owen looked at the bread in her hands. Grace followed his eyes and sighed. When people lose work here, they lose everything. Food first, then housing, then the ability to argue. She placed the bread down. "I learned not to waste anything." Owen opened the cupboard and took out a bowl. "You can learn something else." "What?" "That eating isn't wasting." He placed stew on the table. Grace hesitated. It was a small thing. A bowl of food. But kindness was often harder to accept than cruelty, because cruelty came with no expectation. Grace sat down slowly. While she ate, Owen examined the contracts. The handwriting was neat. The company's seals looked official. Too official. "What did you find?" he asked. Grace swallowed. "The miners aren't just being underpaid." She pointed to a line on the page. "They're being charged for tools they returned, for housing they already paid for supplies they never received." Owen leaned closer. "You're sure?" "I taught these men to read. I watched them copy their own names for the first time." Her voice hardened. They trusted those papers because they believed words on a page meant truth. Owen looked toward the forge. Outside, the sound of machinery filled the valley. The mine never stopped. Neither did the company. "Why were you teaching them?" he asked. Grace looked at the contracts. "Because a man who cannot read what he signs is already fighting with one hand tied." Owen said nothing, because he knew she was right. The workers came to his shop every day. They complained about missing wages, but they always lowered their voices before saying the company's name. Fear had become part of the camp, not because the company had guns everywhere, because everyone knew who controlled the gates. A knock came from the front door. Both of them froze. Owen slowly reached for the hammer beside the forge. Grace stood. "Who is it?" "No one who needs to know you're here." The knock came again. Harder. "Owen Barrett." The voice belonged to a man from the company office. Owen recognized it immediately. The search had begun. Grace looked at the contracts, then at the back door. "Give me the papers. I'll leave." Owen shook his head. "No." "You don't understand." "I understand enough. If they find me here, they'll ruin you." Owen walked to the front of the shop. "Maybe." His hand rested on the door latch. "But I already told them you were my wife." Grace stared at him. The word had started as a lie. Now it carried a weight neither of them had expected. The voice outside called again. Owen, open this door. Owen looked back once. Stay behind me. And for the first time since she entered his wagon, Grace realized something dangerous. She was no longer hiding alone. Owen Barrett opened the blacksmith shop door with the same calm expression he wore when a customer brought him a broken tool. But Grace knew better. A man repairing a wagon spoke carefully because the damage could be measured. A man facing a company supervisor had no idea how far the damage might spread. Standing outside were two company men and Thomas Barrett, Owen's older brother. Thomas looked from Owen to the room behind him. You've caused enough trouble for one day. Owen's face changed slightly. Not anger. Disappointment. You're working for them now? Thomas adjusted his coat. I'm working for the people who pay me. Grace stayed quiet. She recognized the type. A man who had convinced himself that survival and obedience were the same thing. The company men stepped forward. We're looking for a woman who stole company documents. Owen leaned against the doorway. Then you should look for a woman who stole documents. One of the men frowned. You're protecting her? I'm answering your question. Thomas looked past him. You don't understand what you're involved in. Owen looked at his brother. Then explain it. Thomas lowered his voice. Those papers are company property. Grace stepped forward. They are records of what the company took from its workers. Thomas looked at her. For a moment, something like shame crossed his face. Then it disappeared. You always were too certain the world worked the way books said it did. Grace held his gaze. And you always knew men were being cheated. Silence followed. Because that was the truth neither side wanted spoken aloud. Thomas knew. The company's supervisors knew. The miners knew. The only difference was who had enough power to pretend otherwise. The company men searched the shop. Owen did not stop them. That was what worried Grace. A man with a weapon could be expected. A man with patience was harder to read. They opened drawers, moved tools, checked shelves. But Owen had already hidden the contracts beneath the loose boards near the forge. Not because he planned it, because when Grace handed them to him, his first thought had been where they would be safest. Not why they were his problem. The men eventually left, but Thomas remained. You think you're helping them? Owen stared at him. I think I'm stopping something wrong. Thomas shook his head. Owen looked toward the miners walking past outside. They already know. That night, Grace and Owen sat in the blacksmith shop after the lamps were lowered. The camp had grown quiet, but it was not peaceful. It was the silence of people waiting for something bad to happen. Grace spread the contracts across the table. We cannot just show these to the workers. Why not? Because if they cannot explain what is wrong, the company will say we confused them. Owen frowned. Confuse them? The company will make them sound ignorant. They'll say the miners signed willingly. She tapped the papers. The workers need to understand their own words. Owen looked at the rows of numbers. You want to teach them? Yes. In secret? Yes. He glanced toward the window. That's dangerous. Grace gave a tired smile. So was entering that gate. The next evening, the first miner arrived at the blacksmith shop after dark. Then another. Then 3 more. They came quietly. Some removed their hats before entering. Others kept looking over their shoulders. These were men who spent their days underground facing falling rock and broken machinery. But reading a company ledger frightened them more. Grace began with simple things. Names. Dates. Numbers. She did not lecture. She did not tell them they had been cheated. She showed them how to discover it themselves. If your name is here, she said, pointing at the page, you have the right to know what follows it. An older miner traced the line with his finger. I thought this number was my debt. Grace shook her head. It is listed as a debt. The room became still. The difference mattered. One meant truth. The other meant a claim someone wanted you to accept. Night after night, the workshop changed. The sound of the forge mixed with the sound of voices learning. Men who once marked contracts with a thumbprint began writing their own names. Men who once accepted company numbers began checking them. But the company noticed. They noticed when miners stopped signing papers immediately. They noticed when questions started. And they noticed grace. 3 days later, the company manager arrived at the shop carrying a document with an official seal. Owen read it once. Then again. "What is it?" Grace asked. He handed it over. The paper ordered him to surrender his workshop lease for violating company rules. "They're taking your shop." Owen folded the paper. "No." Grace looked at him. "They are trying." Outside, the company manager waited. "You have until morning," the man called. "After that, the forge belongs to the company." Owen stepped onto the porch. "This shop was built before your company came to this valley." The manager smiled. "Everything in this valley belongs to someone." Owen looked back at the miners standing behind him, then at Grace. And he understood the truth. The company did not just want the contracts hidden. They wanted everyone to believe they had no right to question anything. Owen stepped forward. "Then I reckon it's time people learned what belongs to them." That night, Grace found another document hidden among the contracts. A wage ledger, older than the others, and written in a familiar hand. Thomas Barrett's. The man helping the company had not only known about the fraud, he had helped record it. Grace looked at Owen. She knew the truth would hurt him, but hiding it would hurt more. "Your brother is part of this." Owen stared at the page. For the first time since she met him, Grace saw something break through his quiet strength. Not fear. Betrayal. And outside the workshop, the company guards began gathering. The company guards arrived before sunrise. They came expecting a frightened blacksmith who would surrender his shop, a group of miners who would return to their silence, and a schoolteacher who had nowhere left to hide. Instead, they found the forge still burning. Owen stood beside the anvil with Grace behind him, and the miners gathered around the workshop. Nobody held a weapon. Nobody shouted. That was what unsettled the company most. For the first time, the workers were not standing alone. The company manager stepped forward with the order to remove Owen from the property. "You were warned." Owen looked at the paper. "I was." And Owen handed it back. "And I read it." A few miners exchanged looks. Those 2 words mattered, because for years, the company had depended on men signing things they could not understand. Now they had a problem. The workers could read. The manager turned toward Grace. "You taught them to question company documents." Grace answered calmly. "I taught them to understand their own names." The manager smiled. "You think knowledge makes you powerful?" Grace looked around at the miners. "No." She paused. "But it makes people harder to deceive." The guards moved closer. Then Thomas Barrett stepped out of the crowd. Owen saw him, and his expression hardened. For a moment, nobody knew which side he stood on. Thomas held a ledger. The same ledger Grace had found. "I wrote some of these entries." The crowd went silent. The company manager looked at him. "Thomas." But Thomas did not look away. "I told myself I was only recording numbers." His voice lowered. "But numbers can hurt people when the person writing them knows they are false." The manager's face changed. "You know what happens to men who betray the company." Thomas looked at Owen. "I know what happens to men who betray themselves." That was when the company moved. Not with a gunshot. With paperwork. The manager produced another order, claiming the workers were interfering with company operations. The sheriff, standing nearby, stepped forward reluctantly. Owen understood immediately. The company had planned for this. They did not need to prove they were right. They only needed officials to follow their papers long enough. The sheriff looked uncomfortable. "Owen." Owen nodded. "I know." The sheriff lowered his eyes. "I'm supposed to close the shop." The miners stepped back. For one moment, it looked like the company had won. The forge. The school. The evidence. All of it could disappear before anyone outside the camp heard the truth. Then Grace noticed something. The company order had a date written at the bottom. She took the paper from Owen. "This order is impossible." The manager laughed. "Careful, teacher." Grace pointed. This seal was approved before the official who signed it arrived in the valley. The sheriff took the document. He looked closer. The company manager's confidence weakened, but only for a second. "That changes nothing." He turned toward the workers. "You still have no proof that these deductions were false." The words struck harder than any threat, because he was right about one thing. A person could know they were being cheated. Proving it was another matter. That evening, the miners gathered in the blacksmith shop. The company had taken their first advantage. They had damaged the evidence. They had frightened the sheriff. And they had made everyone understand what they were fighting. Grace looked at the workers. "If we go to court, you cannot hide behind me." Nobody spoke. "You must stand there yourselves." An older miner removed his hat. "We don't know how." Grace looked at him. "Yes, you do." She placed the ledger on the table. "You know what you worked?" She pointed to another page. "You know what you were paid." Then she looked around the room. "And now you know how to read the difference." The journey to the county courthouse began before dawn. Owen carried the evidence. Thomas carried the original wage records. The miners carried copies of their own statements. But the company was waiting. Halfway down the road, their wagon wheel was damaged. Not broken by accident. Cut. The evidence almost fell into the mud when Owen jumped down. Men appeared from behind the trees. The company wanted the papers, not a fight. Grace understood immediately. If they take those records, they take the truth with them. Owen grabbed the evidence box. "You get the miners moving. What about you?" Owen looked at the men blocking the road. "I fix broken things." It was the same thing he had always done. Only this time, the broken thing was not a wheel. It was a promise. The miners moved forward while Owen held the road long enough for them to reach the courthouse. He arrived later, bruised and exhausted. But he arrived. Inside the courtroom, the company manager sat confidently. He had lawyers. He had official papers. He had years of control behind him. The miners had only the truth. The judge looked over the first documents. These appear to be signed agreements. The company manager smiled. Grace felt the room turning. This was the moment she feared. A paper could still be stronger than a person's voice. Then the judge looked toward the miners. "Do you understand what you signed?" The courtroom went quiet. One miner stepped forward. "Not when we signed it." The judge looked at him. "Explain." The miner opened the document. "Because we couldn't read it." Another worker stepped forward. Then another. They did not repeat Grace's words. They spoke their own. They explained the wages they earned, the supplies they never received, the debts that appeared after the work was already completed. The company manager shook his head. They were influenced by this woman. He pointed at Grace. She taught them what to say. The judge looked at Grace. For one terrible moment, she wondered if he believed him. Then Thomas stepped forward. "I was the one who entered the numbers." The room changed. The company manager stared at him. "You will regret this." Thomas swallowed. He was afraid. Everyone could see it. His hands shook. His voice nearly failed. But then he looked at Owen, then at the miners, and finally at the ledger. "I regret waiting this long." He explained the entries, the false deductions, the altered accounts, the pressure from company officials. The judge studied the papers. Then he noticed a small detail. The original wage ledger and the company copies had the same dates, but different numbers. The truth was not hidden in a dramatic confession. It was hidden in a mistake. A company clerk had copied the wrong figures from the original record. A mistake made because he believed nobody would ever compare them. The judge closed the ledger. "The workers' claims will be investigated." The company manager stood. "This is not enough." The judge looked at him. "It is enough to stop you from collecting another dishonest debt, until this court finishes its review. For the first time, the manager had no paper left to hide behind. The miners did not cheer. They simply stood there, because they understood something Grace had tried to teach from the beginning. Freedom did not begin when someone powerful gave it to you. It began when you understood that your own voice mattered. Outside the courthouse, Owen stood beside Grace. The fight was not finished. The company still had money, still had influence, but they had lost something more important. They had lost the silence that protected them. And for the first time, Grace looked at Owen and realized the lie they had told at the gate had become something neither of them expected. Not a disguise, not a trick, a promise. The first thing Grace Holloway noticed after the court hearing was that nobody knew what to do with quiet. For months, the mining camp had lived under the sound of orders. Supervisors calling names, guards closing gates, men whispering before speaking. But after the judge's decision, there was a different kind of silence. A silence where people were finally thinking for themselves. The company did not disappear overnight. There were still meetings, still arguments, still papers to review. Justice had opened the door. It had not finished building the house. But something had changed. The miners no longer walked into the company office with their heads lowered and their hands empty. They carried copies of their own records. They asked questions. They read before they signed. And they taught their families what Grace had taught them. A name on a page belonged to the person who carried it, not to the person holding the pen. The blacksmith shop changed too. Owen never called it a school. He said it was still a forge, but everyone in the valley knew better. During the day, he repaired tools. At night, the tables filled with miners learning numbers, letters, and the confidence to challenge anyone who told them they were too ignorant to understand their own lives. Grace stayed. At first, she told herself it was temporary. She would leave when the workers no longer needed her. She would find another town, another school, another place where she could teach without making powerful men uncomfortable. But every time she packed her belongings, she found another reason to wait. A worker proudly signing his own name. A widow from the camp asking Grace to teach her the same lessons she had once been denied. The truth was simple. Grace had spent her life teaching people to read words. Owen had helped her discover that some people also needed someone to believe their voices mattered. Still, one fear remained. Months after the hearing, a storm rolled through the valley. A loud crack of thunder shook the blacksmith shop. Grace froze. For a moment, she was back beneath the wagon canvas, hearing boots outside, waiting for someone to drag her away. Owen noticed. He did not ask her to forget. He did not tell her she was safe as if fear disappeared because someone said so. He simply walked to the door, checked the lock, then returned and placed 2 cups of coffee on the table. Still checking the road, he asked. Grace looked down. Sometimes. Owen nodded. Me too. That answer surprised her, because she had always thought courage meant never being afraid. But Owen had taught her something different. Courage was knowing exactly what you could lose, and standing there anyway. The fake marriage that started at the mining gate became something neither of them planned. Not because a paper said so, not because a company rule required it, because day after day, choice after choice, they built something real. Years later, people in that valley still told the story of the schoolteacher who hid in a supply wagon and the blacksmith who called her his wife before he even knew her name. But they did not remember the story because of the lie. They remembered it because the lie opened a door, and through that door came something stronger. A community that learned to read, workers who learned their worth, a man who discovered that protecting someone else could repair parts of himself he thought were already broken, and a woman who found a place where her voice was not treated as trouble. The old blacksmith shop remained standing long after the mine changed owners. The anvil stayed near the window. The schoolbooks stayed on the shelves. And the door that once opened for a woman hiding from powerful men stayed open for anyone who needed a place to begin again. Because sometimes history does not remember the loudest person in the room. Sometimes it remembers the person who quietly refused to let someone else be silenced. If this story reminded you that one honest voice can change an entire community, write a voice matters in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. And remember this, a door opened in the right moment can become a place where people finally learn they belong.